ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to episode number 335 of the Zombie Train. I'm your host, Ellis, otherwise known as the Admiral or Train Man, if you've been around that long. And on this episode, we are taking a question from Midwestern 261, who now is Fruit 261. And he asks, now, did you guys come across one of the UP U-50s, or SPU-50s, or U-50Cs, C-855s, or DDA-40Xs? The only things I don't know off the top of my head are what the 855s are. I'm not a diesel guy, and I never have been. But I will say that the only recorded instance, to my knowledge, of these larger diesels being used was by the Band of Guardians, and they were out to make a show, and they also only wanted to deal with having one engine, I guess. They had stolen a DDA-40X, whichever the one that Union Pacific had in service before the Great War, or World War Z, I guess. Before the Great Panic, is what I was trying to say. The Great War, yeah. 1914. And the interesting thing to bring up is that engine was stored in Cheyenne with the rest of UP's Heritage Fleet. When the Great Panic happened, obviously it was mostly abandoned, and we came in later and we started using the locomotives. The DDA-40X was there when we started, or actually no, that's not accurate, because the Zombie Train Incorporated happened after this whole thing. It was there when we went over Marias Pass. That's what it is. Because they hadn't reached sufficient strength at this point. At some point between us going over the pass and presumably either their defeat in Portland, but I think it must have been after that, because then they were sort of on the run, on the flight. Yeah. So, they were basically a gang based out of, not northwestern Canada, I guess southwestern Canada. And they were harassing us during our ride over Marias Pass. And they were causing problems for the U.S. military as well. When we arrived in Portland, it became apparent to us very quickly that they were going to be a problem, because we received a message from Seattle that they had shown up and basically were in the process of razing the city and causing all sorts of chaos, which that city was supposed to be protected and was supposed to be safe, and it had been cleared of zombies. So they came into what was effectively a fortified city and pushed out everyone, or killed everyone. And one of the escapees made it down to us, told us what the situation was, and then we had to bring in the bulk of the U.S. Armed Forces to prevent them moving farther south into Portland. Which there was the Battle of Portland, in which a contingent of the Zombie Train, but mostly it was the military and the Band of Guardians. So, sometime after that, then, now that I've got the timeline straight in my head, sometime after that, then, they must have pushed south along the Rocky Mountains. Because after the battle, there was a lull in operations of the military, because it was a huge operation. It was a huge battle, the Battle of Portland. Relatively speaking, it was not something they were really equipped for, because they were mostly dealing with zombies at that point. And the fallout from it was immense, and it led to a brief contraction in the border of what was the safe portion of the United States. So, or North America as a whole. Because there were some parts of Mexico and Canada that were included in that border. So, the contraction and the slowdown of sort of our reinvasion of the United States versus the zombies, that caused I guess, left enough of a gap in oversight to allow the Band of Guardians to come down the Front Range into Cheyenne, at least as far as Cheyenne, and to take this DDA-40X and sort of go on a rampage with it. Now, it was my understanding, because I was on the West Coast for a lot of this, it was my understanding that they had made a significant attempt at cutting off the West Coast from the rest of the United States. They were doing that by using this locomotive and some other equipment that they had either found or made, including flat cars with guns on them, etc. They called it Annex, and they were going around and disabling transcontinental routes. And the zombie train managed to get back through unscathed. I don't know if that was sheer luck, or if it was, if it was planned, like they wanted to let us out and then trap us. I don't think they were thinking that far ahead. I'm not sure if they knew we were coming back east, but I feel like you could have figured that one out if you were them. The situation then became, okay, most of the mountain passes are damaged, and Weibold was out there working for the U.S. Army, I guess, at that point. U.S. Navy, U.S. Army, whatever. And was on the hunt for whoever was destroying all of these passes, because they had, they had begun to notice that this was a problem. And they weren't just going after rail lines, they were going after roads as well. Collapsing tunnels as best they could and things like that. So, they were really hindering that mobility. I don't know why they went with the DDA-40X. I can only assume that it was because it was the largest thing they could get their hands on. It was a single engine, they didn't have to deal with multiple unit operation and stuff like that. It was a real thirsty son of a gun, but I think they had some sort of supply for it. We never figured out where they were getting their fuel. There weren't really too many people to ask. So, yeah. I don't know. Again, the immediate fallout of that was we didn't know where Weibold was, or nobody knew where he was. Nobody knew where Beta Rail had last been sighted. Or nobody knew where they had ended up, I should say. And so we ended up using the newly commissioned Zombie Train, or ZTZ-1, Zombie Train Zeppelin 1, Enterprise to go looking for the last, or the final resting place of Beta Rail, which we eventually found, I believe, somewhere in New Mexico. I can't remember if it was New Mexico or southern Colorado, but I believe it was along Raton Pass. They were working their way south and going one by one, and that was where they were when Weibold managed to get the drop on them, and they had a collision which disabled both trains, and then they fought it out on the ground. They did manage to get a functioning gun, and we thought they were going to try and shoot us down until they realized who we were, or they were going to try it until they realized who we were. Because, you show up in a dirigible that's several hundred feet long, it kind of is it's an entrance. And that's one of my favorite things about using that ship. Anyway, yeah, that was the only instance that I can think of them using, or of such a large engine being used. Because the Zombie Train Incorporated, when we were finally transitioning back to diesel power, we didn't have... We could afford to be picky. And that meant, and I've discussed this before, but that meant we were mostly going for second generation EMDs, because there were a lot of parts available for them, and they were relatively simple. I mean, GEs as well, but less so. They were sort of the second tier of locomotives, because a lot of the second generation GEs, or rather, I should say, there were fewer of them. And there were fewer of them that were in great condition, whereas, like, SD40s and that sort of thing, if those can be considered second generation, I think they're second gen. Maybe they're not. Maybe they're third gen. But that era of diesels, before things got really computerized and difficult to work with from a maintenance perspective, and young enough that there were readily available parts, and also that they were relatively robust engines. I mean, to say, I don't mean to say anything disparaging about the early Jeeps and such, and I can actually cover his next question was about using Alcos, which, again, same situation. We didn't really want to deal with locomotives that either the parts were completely out of production or they were scarce. And I mean, it's not hard to scrounge up parts for an RS3, and by the same token, it's not even that difficult to make parts for an RS3 because they're relatively simple engines, and they were built they were built by who was effectively a steam locomotive manufacturer, and there wasn't a lot of super precise stuff in there, which is why Alcos are what Alcos are. But we tended to avoid stuff we knew we couldn't immediately get running. You know, if anything would leave a question mark as to where do we get these parts, or how do we make these parts, or how compatible is this going to be with the rest of the fleet, it was generally left out of consideration. That's, most of the most modern equipment, because if it started to break down, we had no way of replicating those parts. Most of the older equipment, because we just didn't have them on hand, and so we would have needed to work up a production line for them, which wasn't out of the question, but we didn't really want to do. And most of the non-EMD or GE power, like Alcos, Fairbanks Morse, Davenport, I guess. Some of the really small switchers, these parts that you can make in an automobile shop, some of those definitely got used, but they were not our mainline power. It's worth bringing up the switchers, but oh well. So I hope that answers your question. We tended to avoid stuff we couldn't get our hands on all of the facets for. Like I said, if it was going to leave a question mark as to, a question mark involving any part of the operation, we decided to leave it out. So that left us with a relatively limited range of diesels, but at the same time, it meant that we had a relatively homogeneous fleet, which was a huge improvement over the Zombie Train era, or Zombie Train Incorporated, the steam era, I should say. At least most of it. We had, give or take 1,500 locomotives, and no more than 10 of them were from the same railroad. It was, and every railroad had a different, no more than 10 of them were from the same class, even. So, that definitely created problems, and it was pleasant, you could say, to move on from the Zombie Train steam era, or the mainline steam era, into an era where we had basically all of the same locomotive. And that's one of the reasons why the L1s, or the L2s maybe, I guess you could have called them, that we built, were some of the last engines to be retired, because we had a working production line for them. Why get rid of them? They survived on branch lines and secondary main lines for years after most of the mainline steam was retired. So, there are probably even some bopping around now, because I'm so far divorced from this thing. I make the big decisions and then leave other people to handle whatever. And like I've said in the past, we are downsizing Zombie Train Incorporated operations because private operators have come back onto the scene and are doing a pretty good job of it. So, one of these days, the Zombie Train Incorporated will be a little bit of memory in a museum of the things that happened during the Great Zombie War, World War Z. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. And I managed to knock out two birds with one stone, so I will see you guys. This is the Admiral, signing off.